Why was a man like him standing in a shop like hers? Sarah Martinez had long since stopped asking questions about the people who walked through the dusty glass doors of her father's old gun shop. Most were hunters with stories bigger than their trophies. Some were hobbyists who collected rifles like others collected vinyl records. A few came just to run their hands across steel and walnut as if touching history itself. But this man was different. She noticed it the moment he entered. The bell above the door chimed, sharp against the low hum of the old ceiling fan, and he didn't wander like the others. He didn't glance at the cluttered displays, didn't hesitate at the racks of hunting rifles or the old pistols in their worn leather holsters. No, his eyes went straight to her father's collection, straight to the Springfield, the rifle that had hung untouched on the wall since the day her father died. His gaze wasn't casual. It was calculating, reverent, like a craftsman recognizing the signature of another. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to disappear. Even in plain sight, his hands were steady, shoulders squared, steps deliberate. Every motion was too precise to be random. And that was what unsettled Sarah most. She was elbow deep in oil and solvent when she first looked up at him. 3 years of cleaning weapons had made the motions automatic bolt out. Barrel inspected, chamber checked, parts aligned in perfect order on the mat. Her father had drilled that routine into her before he left her this place. She had kept his order alive, even when the rest of his presence had vanished. The stranger's shadow stretched across her workbench. And for a moment, the air seemed heavier, quieter. He set a rifle down with a careful reverence, the way a priest might place an offering on an altar. Sarah froze, her breath caught because this wasn't the battered hunting gear she was used to. The weapon was alive with detail custom cheek rest, hand-lap barrel. Scope worth more than her truck, stock worn from use but never neglected. She could almost hear her father's voice in the back of her head. This rifle has seen war, but not neglect. And then she saw it stitched and faded on the man's leather jacket. A patch, eagle and trident. She knew what it meant. Marcus. "Chun," he said finally, voice calm, steady. He extended a hand. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron before shaking it. His grip wasn't crushing, just firm, practiced. A handshake that said nothing and everything at once. Sarah Martinez. She replied softly, "Whoever told you I do the best cleaning work in 3 states?" Was probably exaggerating, but Marcus didn't smile, not yet. His eyes were scanning again. The shop, the arrangement of tools, the meticulous labels she'd kept for ammunition calibers, the order her father had left, the order she had preserved. Like a shrine. Professional, he said, almost to himself. It isn't about appearances. It's about precision. Precision. The word lingered in the air. The word that had defined her father's entire life. Sarah set to work. She had her ritual. First a visual inspection, then the slow disassembly. Each part placed in exact sequence, always in the same order. It wasn't just habit, it was respect. She could feel Marcus's eyes on her, tracking every move. "You handle that like you've been shooting for decades," he murmured. Sarah laughed, though it came out more brittle than amused. "I've never fired a shot in my life." The words surprised him. She could tell. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, studying her in silence. She didn't look up, didn't want to. It was easier to focus on the bolt in her hands, on the gleam of the steel under the magnifying lamp. "My dad always said he'd teach me when I was ready," she added quietly, "but he died before he could." The shop fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock and the faint hiss of the fan. For Sarah, silence had become its own language. After her father's accident, silence filled the empty rooms of the house. It seeped into the shop, into her nights, into the way she kept her head down when customers asked questions she didn't want to answer. She'd grown used to it, maybe even dependent on it. But this silence, Marcus's silence, felt different. It wasn't absence, it was measurement. He was weighing her words, her posture, the steadiness of her hands. "This rifle has seen action," she said, almost defensively, running a finger along the custom trigger assembly. Marcus finally spoke. "What would you say it was built for?" Sarah hesitated. She'd read about it, learned it in her father's notes, in the margins of ballistic charts stained with coffee and ink, but saying it out loud felt like crossing some invisible line. "Extreme distance," she whispered. "Maybe 1,500 meters. If the shooter knew what they were doing." 1,500, Marcus repeated softly, as if testing the word on his tongue. Then his eyes met hers, sharp, unflinching. "And what if I told you the right hands could push further?" Sarah set the bolt down carefully, her pulse quickening. His tone wasn't hypothetical. It was a challenge. "I'd say that would depend entirely on the shooter." And for the first time since he'd entered the shop, Marcus smiled. It wasn't warmth she saw in his expression. It was recognition. 3 days later, he came back, but this time his rifle wasn't with him. The moment Sarah saw the manila folder under his arm, she knew this wasn't about a cleaning job. The way he paused in the doorway, the way his eyes swept the shop, it wasn't casual. It was deliberate. "Your rifle's ready," she called automatically, her voice steadier than she felt, cleaned and calibrated. "I know," Marcus said, but he didn't move toward it. Instead, he walked to her father's private collection, the rifle Sarah had promised herself she would never sell. His gaze lingered on the Remington her father had used in long-range competitions, on the delicate hand-etched notes Eduardo Martinez had left on the stock. "Tell me about your father." The question struck her harder than she expected. Few customers ever asked, to most. Eduardo was just a name on the old business sign. To her, he was a ghost in every corner of this place. "He trained military snipers for years," Marcus continued quietly, almost as if he already knew the answer. "3-time national champion, developed ballistic methods still in use today." "I did my research." Sarah froze. Very few people knew that much. Fewer still respected what it meant. "He never taught you to shoot," Marcus said, turning now to face her directly. "Why?" The question cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She'd asked herself the same thing, countless nights staring at her father's empty chair. "He said I wasn't ready," she whispered. "He said shooting wasn't a game. It demanded respect, maturity, responsibility." She swallowed. "He wanted to wait until I was old enough, but he never got the chance." Marcus nodded slowly, as if confirming something. Then he set the folder down. Inside was a photograph. Grainy, distant, a desert landscape, a steel plate target barely visible against the horizon. Numbers scribbled in the margin. 3,871 meters. 24 meters, confirmed kill. "That's the current world record," Marcus said. "Canadian Special Forces, 2017. The bullet was in flight for over 10 seconds. Sarah stared at the numbers. The mathematics came alive in her head. Wind drift, bullet drop, atmospheric pressure, a Coriolis effect, Earth's rotation. The sheer improbability of it pressed down on her chest. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because," Marcus said, his voice quieter now, "I think you could break it." The words landed like a stone in her stomach. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss it. She wanted to tell him he was insane, but something in his eyes silenced her. He wasn't joking. He wasn't exaggerating. He was deadly serious. Sarah looked at the photograph again, at the impossible shot frozen in black and white. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Precision isn't about the rifle. It's about the person behind it." Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. "Even if I wanted to," she said carefully, "I've never even held a loaded weapon." Marcus smiled faintly, but this time it wasn't recognition. It was conviction. "Exactly," he said. "And that's why you might be the one who can." That night, long after she'd closed the shop, Sarah sat alone at the counter. The photograph spread out in front of her. The clock ticked steadily, The smell of gun oil lingered on her hands. She wanted to push it away, to return to her safe routines, but something had already shifted. The photograph wasn't just a record. It was a dare, and Sarah Martinez had never been one to walk away from a challenge. Why did her hands feel steady when her heart was racing? The thought struck Sarah the moment she lay prone on the firing line, her cheek pressed against the unfamiliar stock of a Remington 700. The rifle was heavier than she'd imagined, not in weight, but in consequence. This wasn't disassembly on a workbench. This wasn't theory written in the margins of her father's manuals. This was live ammunition, a real round-chambered, a target downrange waiting to be pierced, and her pulse was wild. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine from the valley. Mist clung to the edges of the range, curling like smoke, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Marcus crouched beside her, calm as stone, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses. He didn't look nervous. He didn't even look expectant. He just watched. "First rule," he said quietly. "The rifle is always loaded, even when it's not." Sarah nodded. "Second rule, don't aim at anything you're not willing to destroy." She nodded again, her throat dry. "Third, finger off the trigger until you're ready." Her finger hovered over the guard, trembling, her palms damp despite the cool air. Marcus adjusted the bipod legs, aligning the rifle with the target. At 100 yards, a simple paper silhouette. Nothing alive, nothing dangerous. Yet Sarah's chest felt as if it carried the weight of something much larger. "Forget what you've seen in movies," Marcus said. "This isn't about force. It's about stillness." Stillness. She tried to focus on that word, tried to drown out the pounding of her heart. The scope framed the world in a circle, magnifying the paper target until it looked impossibly close and impossibly far at once. The crosshairs floated, rising and falling with each breath. "Breathe," Marcus reminded her. "Take it in. Let half of it out. Hold. Don't rush." Sarah inhaled, exhaled halfway, then held. The world narrowed to the scope, the crosshairs. The soft leather of the trigger under her fingertip, she squeezed. The rifle cracked, sharp and violent, echoing across the valley. The recoil surprised her, though it wasn't as brutal as she'd feared. Through the scope, she saw a neat hole appear on the paper low and left of the bullseye. Her heart stopped. She had hit it. Not the center. Not perfect. But the target bore proof of her shot. "Not bad," Marcus said, peering through binoculars. "Most people miss the paper entirely their first time." Sarah blinked, lowering her head from the scope. The rifle lay warm against her shoulder, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. She'd actually done it. "It's low," she murmured. "Low and left." Marcus tilted his head. "And why do you think that is?" "The crosshairs felt slightly off," Sarah said, thinking aloud. "Trigger pull was smooth, but no, it wasn't me. The scope needs adjustment." His binoculars lowered slowly, his face unreadable. "Most beginners blame themselves. You didn't." She shook her head. "If it felt right in my body, then the error is mechanical. That's what Dad always said. Trust the system, not the panic." The second shot was closer. The third, closer still. By the fifth, she was grouping inside the inner ring. Each pull steadied her more, each crack of the rifle anchoring her deeper into the mathematics of the moment. Wind speed, trigger pressure, bullet drop. She could feel the variables like threads tugging through her mind, aligning into something she almost recognized. When she looked up, Marcus was silent. His binoculars dangled from one hand. "This is impossible," he muttered finally. Sarah frowned. "I'm not even at the bullseye yet." "Not that," he said. "What you're doing, the way you adjust, the way you process. Beginners don't shoot like this. They fight the rifle. You listen to it." Sarah almost laughed. "It's just 100 yards, a controlled environment. No wind, perfect lighting. Anyone could. Wrong. Marcus's tone sharpened. I've trained professionals who couldn't group like. That their first day, Sarah lowered her eyes. Pride threatened to rise, but she pushed it down. This wasn't pride. It was curiosity, because every shot didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like a calculation, like something inside her had been waiting. She didn't dare say it out loud. Instead, she asked, "Can we try a longer distance?" 200 yards. The target seemed to shrink, a postage stamp in the haze. Sarah spent long minutes studying the flags, watching how the fabric lifted and dipped in the morning breeze. She remembered her father's notes, the scribbled margins. About air density, temperature gradients. She adjusted her scope carefully. Marcus didn't interrupt. He just watched, arms folded, lips pressed into a tight line. When she fired, the bullet struck the dead center. A soft sound escaped her throat, half laugh, half disbelief. Beginner's luck. She whispered, though her voice betrayed excitement. Marcus shook his head. Slowly, gravely, "Sarah, that wasn't luck." By the end of the session, Sarah was hitting 300 yards consistently, her shots grouping tight enough to be covered by a coin. Other shooters on the range had stopped to watch. She felt their eyes, but the weight of their curiosity didn't rattle her. It almost didn't exist, because in her head, something else was happening. Every shot was a puzzle piece. Every adjustment was a solution sliding into place. She wasn't fighting nerves anymore. She wasn't even thinking in words. She was thinking in trajectories, in curves, in invisible arcs carved through the air, and with every pull of the trigger, it felt less like she was learning and more like she was remembering. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her body ached from lying prone for hours, but her mind refused to rest. Equations danced in her head. Bullet drop, wind drift, the Coriolis effect her father had scribbled notes about but never explained. For years, those calculations had been abstract, symbols on paper. Now they had weight. They had sound. Recoil, vibration. She dreamed of numbers. Yes, but now those numbers carried the echo of her rifle shot, the smell of burnt powder, the rhythm of her breath syncing with the world. And beneath it all, a memory surfaced. Her father's voice, low and steady, speaking from some corner of the past she'd tried not to revisit. Precision isn't about power, sweetheart. It's about patience. About knowing when stillness tells you more than action ever could. For the first time since his death, Sarah didn't feel the silence of his absence. She felt the echo of his presence, and that echo was pulling her forward. Marcus was waiting the next morning. He didn't waste words. He just laid the rifle down in front of her, the same Remington, its steel cool with morning dew. 200 wasn't enough for you, was it? He asked. Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. No, she said. It wasn't. Marcus smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't warm, but sharpened. Good, he said, because 300 was just the beginning. That was when Sarah realized something terrifying. She didn't want to stop. When had the shop started to feel like a stranger's place? Sarah couldn't pinpoint the exact day. One week, it was just a small shift, an unreturned phone call, a backlog of orders waiting on the counter. Then it was the dust settling on rifles. She used to polish daily, the faint smell of solvent replaced by the sour scent of neglect. Somewhere along the way, her father's workshop, the place she had guarded like a shrine, had become something she walked past without really seeing. Because every spare hour was now spent at the range. At first, Marcus had insisted on moderation. Twice a week, maybe 3. But soon those rules fell away, not because he pushed, but because she did. She wanted more, needed more. By the end of the second month, the rangemaster didn't even blink when he saw her truck parked outside at dawn. She was there so often she'd stopped being a guest and started being part of the scenery. And with every session, the impossible felt a little less impossible. 500 yards, then 800. The targets shrank until they were specks the edge of vision. But Sarah's groups held tight. Tighter than they should have. Marcus watched through his binoculars, shaking his head as if disbelief was becoming habit. "This is ridiculous," he muttered one afternoon, staring at the neat cluster of holes Sarah had punched into steel at 1,200 yards. "I've been shooting 20 years, and I wouldn't bet on myself making that shot." Every time, Sarah barely looked up from her scope. "Then let's try 1,500. But it wasn't just skill. It was obsession. Her notebooks, once tidy ledgers of shop inventory, had transformed into chaotic journals. Pages crammed with formulas, wind calculations, sketches of airflow patterns. She tested herself constantly. What happens to air density when humidity drops at this elevation? How does bullet drift change at 2,000 yards with a crosswind at 5 mph? The questions consumed her. The answers chased her into sleepless nights. Marcus noticed before she admitted it to herself. "When's the last time you took a day off?" he asked one morning, watching her scribble wind data even before she'd uncased her rifle. "Day off from what?" she said without looking up. "From this. This isn't work," she murmured, adjusting her scope. "This is what I'm supposed to be doing." The way she said it made Marcus's chest tighten. He'd seen this before in soldiers who pushed too far, too fast, in himself. The difference was that Sarah wasn't chasing glory. She wasn't trying to prove herself. What drove her was quieter, deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Then came the storm. That morning, the range flag snapped violently, the sky heavy with rolling clouds. Wind gusts whipped across the valley, scattering dust like smoke. Marcus called it off immediately. "This isn't shootable," he said, pulling his hood tight against the rain. "We'll try tomorrow." But Sarah was already lying prone, her rifle settled, her notebook open to a page crammed with scribbles about fluid dynamics. "Consistent conditions are easy," she said. "Chaos is real. This is where you learn." Marcus stared at her, half in awe, half in fear. She waited, minutes at a time, studying the cycles of the storm, the way gusts came in waves, the way the rain shifted with the wind. She mapped the chaos until it wasn't chaos anymore. Then she squeezed the trigger. The bullet flew for more than 3 seconds, a lifetime in the air. Marcus braced for failure. Instead, the steel rang, dead center. His jaw tightened. "How?" "The storm creates patterns," Sarah said, chambering another round. "Chaos isn't random. You just have to see in 3 dimensions." Her second shot hit within inches of the first. The third was closer still. Marcus realized then he wasn't just training someone exceptional. He was witnessing something that defied explanation. But obsession has a price. That night, Sarah didn't go home. She stayed until well past midnight, shooting under the glare of floodlights, her body trembling from exhaustion but her mind unwilling to stop. By dawn, Marcus found her asleep in her truck, ballistic charts spread across the dashboard, her rifle still on the bench outside. "Sarah," he said gently, handing her a coffee, "you've been here 14 hours. She blinked, disoriented, hair damp with sweat, hands ink-stained from notes. For a moment, her facade cracked. She looked at the chaos she'd created: scattered notebooks, empty cans, targets riddled with holes, and something like fear flickered in her eyes. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted quietly. "The way everything has to align perfectly. It's like there's this puzzle in my head, and every shot gets me closer to the answer." Marcus knew that feeling. He also knew the danger of it, but there was no stopping her now. A week later, he asked the question he'd been dreading. "What's the longest shot you think you could make?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She stared out at the targets lined along the ridge, her gaze distant, her mind calculating possibilities. Finally, she said softly, "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." The test range Marcus chose wasn't public. It belonged to a retired Marine colonel named Harrison, who owed Marcus enough favors not to ask too many questions. The facility stretched farther than Sarah had ever seen targets at distances measured in miles. Not yards. 2 miles, Harrison said, pointing toward a barely visible plate on the horizon. We use it for equipment testing, not shooters. Conditions out there aren't just difficult. They're cruel. Sarah studied the scope. The target was a speck, barely more than a shimmer in the desert heat. Her mind spun with numbers, the flight time over 6 seconds. The layers of wind, each one with its own pattern. The subtle variations in temperature from ground to air. Can I try? She asked. Harrison raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Marcus nodded. She's ready. The first shot missed wide. The second was closer. By the fifth, her rounds were grouping inside the plate, metal ringing faintly across the desert like distant bells. When the final shot struck dead center, Harrison lowered his binoculars and looked at her the way a man looks at a miracle. Miss Martinez, he said softly, I think we need to talk. That night, Sarah sat alone again. This time in Harrison's office, surrounded by decades of maps and ballistic charts. The colonel laid a folder on the desk photographs. Calculations, her own impossible targets stacked in evidence. In 6 weeks, he said, the International Long Range Shooting Association is hosting the Extreme Distance Challenge. One shot, 3,800 meters, attempted and succeed. And you'll hold the new world record. The words rang in Sarah's ears, heavier than the storm, heavier than her father's silence, heavier than the rifle itself. 3,800 meters. Marcus shifted uneasily beside her. She's only been shooting 2 months. This isn't enough time. That's exactly why it might work, Harrison countered. No baggage, no. Years of bad habits. She treats each shot like a problem to be solved. Sarah's eyes drifted to the photographs on the desk, proof of her own progression. From 100 yards to over 2 miles. Her breath caught. Why me? She asked. There are shooters with decades more experience. Because, Harrison said firmly, none of them can do what you just did. And for the first time, Sarah felt that hope tangled with fear, pride sharpened by doubt. She thought of her father, the lessons he'd meant to teach but never had the chance. She thought of the silence she'd lived in, the smallness of her life compared to the vastness of what stood before her now. Could she really do it? Or would she be remembered as the woman who dared too much, too soon? The pen was in her hand before she realized she'd picked it up. And when she signed her name, she knew there was no going back. What happens when preparation collides with fear? That was the question Sarah asked herself every morning in the Nevada desert. She'd been there 3 days already, yet the landscape still felt alien. Endless scrub and sand stretched in all directions, shimmering under the rising heat. The Precision Shooting Institute's compound stood like a fortress against emptiness. Its ranges measured not in yards, but in miles. It should have felt like opportunity. Instead, it felt like judgment. Because for the first time since she picked up a rifle, Sarah wasn't training in silence. She wasn't just a woman at a forgotten valley range. Learning in the shadows, she was being watched by Marcus, who studied her every move with the worry of a man who'd invested not just his time, but his faith, by Colonel Harrison, who seemed determined to turn her into history, not just a shooter, by strangers, reporters, photographers, competitors circling the event like vultures. The whispers had already spread. A gun shop owner. No military background, 4 months of shooting. Attempting 3,800 meters. Attempting to step into a record no one thought could be broken. Do you hear them? Sarah asked Marcus one night as they walked past the gathering tents. Voices drifted from journalists smoking by their equipment trucks. Laughter from shooters who'd already written her off. I hear them, Marcus said evenly. They think I'm a joke. They thought that before every record was broken, he replied. They laughed until the shot rang out. But Sarah couldn't shake the voices. The idea of them watching, expecting her to fail, pressed against her chest like a weight at night. She lay awake in the sterile dorm room the Institute had given her, staring at the ceiling, equations spinning through her mind until they blurred into noise. Harrison pushed her hard. World records aren't broken by casual effort. He reminded her daily, we're not just testing your skill. We're testing your mind under fire. He wasn't wrong. Shooting 3,800 meters wasn't just about the rifle. It was about withstanding pressure. It was about quieting everything: the wind, the math, the crowd, the doubt, until only the shot remained. So Harrison brought in specialists, sports psychologists who coached Olympic athletes on pressure, breathing instructors who taught her how to lower her heart rate in seconds, even military veterans who explained what it meant to perform with lives on the line. But nothing prepared her for the loneliness, because at the end of each day, when the cameras were gone, when the consultants packed their clipboards, it was still just her and the rifle. The rifle itself became her anchor. It was the same 338 Lapua Magnum Marcus had first brought into her shop, now refined to fit her perfectly, stock molded to her frame, trigger tuned to the ounce, scope calibrated with obsessive care. At night, when she couldn't sleep, she sat with it, running her hands along the steel, the wood, the scope's cold glass. She cleaned it not because it needed it, but because she did. Each pass of the cloth steadied her. Each click of a bolt reminded her of order in the chaos. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was the only thing that made sense. But inside, cracks were forming. One morning, after hours of practice, Marcus found her staring at the desert horizon. Her face pale, her hands trembling. "What's wrong?" he asked. Her voice came quiet, broken. "What if I miss?" Marcus studied her carefully. He could see the weight she carried, not just the record, but her father's legacy, the whispers of doubters, the fear of becoming a cautionary tale. "Then you miss," he said finally. She looked at him sharply. "That's it?" "Yes, that's it. You miss, and you keep living. But if you never take the shot, Sarah, you'll live the rest of your life wondering what might have been." Her chest ached at the truth of it. She wanted to believe him, but the fear didn't vanish. It just sat there, like a stone in her stomach. The pressure wasn't only internal. Media requests multiplied. Cameras followed her on the range. Microphones thrust in her face as she tried to focus. They asked about her lack of experience, about the absurdity of a record attempt after mere months of training. "How does it feel?" One reporter asked bluntly, "To know most people expect you to fail?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tightening. For a moment she almost faltered, almost told them the truth, that she was terrified. But then she remembered her father's words. Dignity doesn't argue, it proves. So she answered simply, "We'll find out." The clip aired that night. To her surprise, it spread. Some mocked her confidence. Others admired her restraint. But either way, the world was watching. The hardest test came not from the media, but from Harrison himself. "You've mastered the equations," he told her one morning, handing her a blank target sheet. "Now I want you to fire blind." "What?" "No wind flags, no instruments. Just you, your instincts, and what you feel." It was madness. Everything she knew was built on calculation. But Harrison insisted, a record shot isn't just physics. It's trust. Trusting yourself when the numbers blur. The first shot missed wide. Sarah felt the sting of failure crawl under her skin. She wanted to stop, wanted to go back to her notebooks, her equations, but Marcus's voice came quietly from behind. "Breathe, listen, trust your hands." The second shot rang the steel, and when Sarah lifted her head from the scope, the tightness in her chest loosened, because for the first time, she understood. Instinct wasn't the enemy of precision. It was its partner. The days blurred into a rhythm of heat and fatigue, of missed meals and late nights of scribbled notes. Her body thinned, her eyes hollowed, but her focus sharpened like a blade. She was living in a tunnel now. The world outside, the shop she'd left behind. The life she'd once thought was enough felt like someone else's memory, and at the end of it, only one truth remained. In 6 weeks, she would stand at the line, 3 shots in her hands. The world waiting to see if a woman who had once been just a caretaker of her father's tools could rewrite history. The night before the attempt, Sarah sat alone in her room. The rifle leaned against the wall, polished, waiting. She thought of her father, of the lessons he'd meant to give her, of the life he'd built with precision, with patience, with dignity. Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from the ache of absence. "Dad," she whispered into the silence, "I hope I make you proud." Then she closed her eyes and prayed the silence would answer. Why did the target look smaller today than it ever had before? Sarah had stared at it through high-powered scopes for weeks, memorizing every contour, every shimmer of heat around the steel plate. She had studied the air currents, the way morning winds shifted by degree, the way the desert floor breathed heat that rose invisible but powerful. She knew the mathematics. She knew the feel. Yet on this morning, the morning of the attempt, the target seemed to shrink into impossibility. 3,800 meters, nearly 2.5 miles. A bullet's journey measured not in seconds, but in eternity. The desert air was cold at dawn, but already restless. Wind curled low across the scrub, steady but sly, threatening to shift when least expected. Marcus set the weather instruments down carefully, his movements clipped, controlled. He wasn't smiling. He hadn't smiled in days. "Conditions are steady," he said softly. "About as good as we'll get." Sarah didn't answer. Her gaze was locked on the steel square in the distance. Through the scope, it looked like a smudge, a shadow against the horizon. Behind them, the crowd gathered. Military officials in pressed uniforms, journalists with cameras ready, ballistics experts, murmuring in skeptical tones. Even veteran shooters had flown in, some out of curiosity, others to watch her fail. Their voices hummed like insects, low and constant, a background noise she couldn't ignore. "Miss Martinez," one of the ILRSA officials said, clipboard in hand, "are you ready to begin?" Sarah's fingers flexed against the rifle stock. Her throat felt tight. She nodded once. The range fell silent. Her rifle lay in front of her like a living thing, cold, heavy, exact. It was the same 338 Lapua Magnum Marcus had brought into her shop months ago, now fitted perfectly to her frame. The trigger weight matched her preference. The cheek rest molded to her jaw. Every bolt, every screw carried her hours of care. She took her position, prone against the desert earth, scope fixed. On the horizon, her heart hammered, one shot at a time. That was what Marcus had drilled into her. Don't think of the crowd. Don't think of the record. Just the rifle, just the target, just the space between. She inhaled, exhaled halfway, held, and squeezed. The rifle cracked like thunder. The recoil pressed against her shoulder. For almost 7 seconds, the bullet flew, a dot unseen against the sky. The desert held its breath, then impact, not on the plate. A puff of dust kicked up 20 feet left of the target. The crowd stirred, not surprise, expectation. Whispers traveled quickly. She's out of her depth. 4 months of training. What did they expect? Sarah's jaw clenched. She kept her eye on the scope, refusing to flinch. "Wind shift," Marcus murmured, checking his instruments. "Thermal currents stronger than predicted. At just 2 clicks right. Trust the data." Sarah nodded faintly. But inside, doubt cut like glass. 1 miss, 2 left. She steadied herself again. Adjusted, breathed. Second shot, the crack rang out, the desert swallowing the sound. The bullet arced, invisible, crossing layers of air, drifting, falling, bending. Impact. Closer, much closer. The round struck the target frame, just inches from the scoring plate. The murmurs shifted. Skepticism paused. Curiosity ignited. Cameras clicked rapidly. Sarah allowed herself a single breath of relief, but it wasn't enough. 2 shots down, 1 left. The silence around her grew heavier, thick with expectation. She closed her eyes. Her father's voice rose in memory, quiet, steady. "Sometimes, sweetheart, you have to stop thinking and trust your hands." Had she been overthinking? Every calculation, every number written in her notebooks, every adjustment, it all mattered. But had she buried instinct under equations? Her father had lived by precision, but he had also lived by feel. She opened her eyes, her pulse steadying, her breath softening. Marcus crouched beside her, his voice low. "This is it, Sarah. Whatever happens, remember missing doesn't define you. Not trying does." She swallowed, nodded once. Then she returned to the scope. The desert blurred into stillness. The chatter behind her faded. The target, so impossibly small, so impossibly far, hung suspended in the glass. She aligned her body, felt the earth beneath her chest, felt the wind brush her cheek. Her heart slowed, 1 beat, another, a rhythm she could trust. She inhaled, exhaled halfway, held, her finger tightened. The trigger broke. The bullet left the chamber, and for 68 seconds, Sarah's life hung in the air. The crowd leaned forward, binoculars raised, eyes straining across the distance. The officials gripped their radios. Marcus held his breath. Sarah watched through her scope. Following the invisible arc she had memorized 100 times in her mind. Then impact, a puff of dust, and the unmistakable metallic ring, faint but clear, carrying across the desert like a church bell. Direct hit, dead center. For a moment, there was no sound. The world seemed frozen, suspended like the bullet had been in flight. Then the radio crackled. Target struck. Dead center, 3,847 meters, confirmed. The silence shattered. Applause erupted. Cheers rose like a wave. Cameras fired in rapid succession. Journalists shouted questions. Military officials whispered urgently to one another. But Sarah didn't move. She stayed prone, her cheek still against the rifle, her eyes still on the scope, staring at the target as if afraid it might vanish. She had done it, and yet she felt strangely still. Marcus knelt beside her, his voice breaking with awe. "Sarah, you just rewrote history." But Sarah's eyes filled with tears, not from pride, not from relief, but from something deeper. She thought of her father, of the years she had spent alone in the shop, dusting his tools, living in silence, of the lesson he had never had the chance to teach. And she realized she had just lived it. Not in numbers, not in records, but in the stillness between heartbeats, when instinct met patience and dignity spoke louder than applause. Why did victory feel so heavy? Sarah had imagined what it would be like, though she would never admit it out loud. She thought there would be relief, maybe even joy. But as the crowd around her roared, as cameras flashed, as strangers shouted her name, she felt only a strange kind of silence. The desert was still ringing from the impact. The sound of metal struck from nearly 2.5 miles away. It should have been impossible, yet she had done it. Her bullet had crossed the distance, obeyed her hands, defied the doubts. Marcus squeezed her shoulder, his face shining with pride. Harrison nodded once, tight-lipped, the kind of approval that carried weight. Officials hurried to verify, to document, to make history official. And Sarah stayed prone on the ground, staring at the horizon, her cheek pressed to the stock, as if she didn't trust the target was real unless she kept it in her scope. She whispered, so quietly only she could hear, "Dad, I did it." The hours after blurred into chaos. She was escorted to a tent where journalists crowded close, their microphones jabbing, their voices overlapping. How does it feel to break the world record? Was this luck or skill? What does this mean for women in shooting sports? She tried to answer, but the words felt like borrowed clothes. "It was precision," she said softly, "and patience, that's all." But they wanted more. They wanted sound bites, declarations, the kind of quotes that would fit neatly in headlines. Behind her, Marcus stood like a wall, shielding her from the worst of it. Harrison tried to usher the crowd into order, but it was impossible. The moment had become too big by the end of the day. Sarah's face was already everywhere on news broadcasts, military blogs, social feeds. Gun shop owner breaks sniper record. Woman with 4 months training stuns experts. Martinez miracle shot. The calls began that night. Equipment companies offering sponsorships. Military contractors dangling money. Training, jobs, invitations to competitions, requests for interviews. Her phone buzzed until she turned it off and left it face down on the nightstand. She sat in the dim light of the dorm room, her rifle across her knees, cleaning it again though. It was spotless. Her hands moved automatically, cloth against steel, oil in measured drops. It wasn't the rifle that needed care. It was her. Why didn't it feel like triumph? Why did it feel like loss? Marcus noticed it too. "You should be celebrating," he said as they walked the next morning. Desert sun already burning the horizon. "You just did something no human has ever done." Sarah kept her gaze on the ground. "Then why do I feel smaller than I did yesterday?" Marcus frowned. "Smaller?" Everyone wants to make it about the shot, about numbers, records. But that wasn't what mattered. Her voice broke slightly. "It wasn't about the target. It was about my dad, about finally understanding what he tried to teach me." Marcus slowed his steps. "And you did understand. That's what makes the record matter." She shook her head. "The record belongs to the world. That moment belonged to me." Colonel Harrison cornered her later that day. His voice clipped with urgency. "You're about to have doors open most shooters never even dream of," he said. "This is bigger than you now. Sarah, don't waste it." "Bigger than me," she repeated softly. "Defense contracts, training, programs, equipment design. You could change how the world thinks about precision shooting." But Sarah only thought about the quiet of her father's shop, the tools lined neatly, the dust-covered counters waiting for her return, the simplicity of cleaning a rifle for someone who would never know her name. What good was bigger if it meant losing what was hers? That night, she and Marcus sat outside under the desert stars, away from the noise, away from the calls. "What do you want, Sarah?" he asked gently. She didn't answer right away. She listened to the silence, to the wind curling over the sand. "I want..." She hesitated. "I want to make sure that wasn't the end of something. I want it to be the beginning." Marcus studied her. "Beginning of what?" "Not records, not fame, something that matters." He nodded slowly. "Then you already know where to go." In the days that followed, Sarah turned down contracts. She declined sponsorships. She refused offers that promised money, power, recognition. The headlines began to shift. From awe to confusion. Record breaker disappears. Martinez turns down millions. But Sarah didn't care, because the rifle that had carried her into history now hung quietly on the wall of her father's shop. And the shop itself was no longer just a relic. She began to transform it. The back room, once storage, became a classroom. The dusty lot behind it, an improvised range. Marcus joined her, sketching plans, dragging in targets, laying out mats. Together they built not a business, but a sanctuary. People came. At first, a handful of curious shooters, then dozens, then more, traveling across states, even countries, to learn from the woman who had broken the impossible. Sarah taught them not just about ballistics or wind reading, but about patience, about respect, about what her father had instilled in her, that dignity isn't loud, and precision isn't pride. She never bragged about the record. She rarely even mentioned it. The rifle stayed on the wall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes history isn't the point. Sometimes the point is what you do after. But in the quiet moments, when the students had gone, when the shop was still again, Sarah would pause at the counter, run her fingers along the wood worn smooth by years of her father's hands. She thought of him. She thought of the lessons he never spoke, the ones she had discovered on her own. And she knew this was what he had meant all along. Not the noise, not the headlines, but the stillness. And yet, even as she found peace in teaching, Sarah carried something unresolved. A whisper at the edge of silence, a question that lingered. What if the shot wasn't her greatest act? What if it was just the door opening? Because buried beneath the pride, beneath the calm, was a restlessness. A knowledge that the world she had touched, the world of impossible distances, of precision, beyond reason, wasn't finished with her yet. Why did teaching feel harder than breaking the record? Sarah hadn't expected that. She thought passing on knowledge would be simple, almost natural. After all, she had the math, the precision, the instinct. She had lived the moment when the impossible bent beneath her hands. Surely she could explain it. Surely others could follow. But when she looked down the line at her students, young men and women from all walks of life, some wide-eyed, some cocky, she realized the truth. You can't teach stillness. You can't write instinct into a notebook. She stood behind a young recruit one afternoon, his breathing ragged, his shoulders tense as he tried to settle on a target 200 yards away. "Relax," Sarah said softly. "I am relaxed," he snapped back, frustration bleeding through. She knelt beside him, her voice low, steady. "Then why is your jaw clenched? Why are your shoulders fighting the rifle instead of holding it?" The boy shifted uncomfortably, embarrassed. Sarah adjusted his grip, his posture, then placed a hand lightly on the stock. "This isn't about fighting," she whispered. "It's about letting the rifle breathe with you." He fired. The shot missed wide. His head dropped. "I'll never get this." Sarah felt the echo of her own early fears, the memory of her first day with Marcus. She crouched lower, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You will," she said firmly, "because you already took the hardest step." You showed up. Not all her students listened. Some came for glory, wanting the secret shortcut to skill. They tried to copy her movements, mimic her calculations, as if she were a formula they could memorize. Those were the ones who left disappointed, but others quiet, patient, willing to be broken down and built back up, those stayed. And with them, Sarah felt something stir. The same stirring she'd felt when her father's lessons had first awakened inside her. She realized then that teaching wasn't about making others into her. It was about helping them become themselves. Marcus became her partner in this new life, though not without tension. "You can't carry them all," he warned her one night as they locked up the shop. "Some of them aren't ready. Some never will be." "I know," Sarah said. "But what if my dad had thought that about me? What if he never believed I'd be ready?" Marcus's expression softened. "He did believe. That's why he waited. He wanted you to grow into it." Sarah turned away, blinking against the sting of memory. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe her father had trusted her enough to wait. But another voice whispered darker thoughts. What if he never thought she'd be enough? The pull of unfinished challenges returned slowly, almost unnoticed at first. She'd be teaching at the range when a gust of wind rattled the targets. And part of her would wonder, how would I calculate that drift at 2 miles? She'd glance at the rifle on her wall, and her hands would itch, remembering the recoil, the silence of flight, the ring of steel on steel. At night, when the students were gone and the shop lay still, she'd find herself flipping open old notebooks, running her fingers over formulas she hadn't used since Nevada. She told herself she was just reviewing, just remembering. But the truth pressed closer each time. The shot that had defined her wasn't enough. One evening, she stayed late after the last student had gone. The range stretched empty in the fading light, the targets dark silhouettes against the horizon. She pulled her rifle from the wall, laid it out on the bench, and stared at it. The air was cool, the wind light, perfect conditions. Her hands trembled as she chambered around. She wasn't aiming for a record. She wasn't aiming for history. She was aiming for silence, for the part of herself that still felt unfinished, still restless. The rifle cracked, the steel rang, and for a fleeting second, Sarah felt the same. Clarity she had in Nevada, the world narrowing, the silence expanding, the impossible folding into her hands. But when the echo faded, all that remained was emptiness. Marcus found her cleaning the rifle an hour later, her movements sharp, almost frantic. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what are you doing?" She didn't look up. "Just practicing. You don't need to prove anything anymore." Her hand stilled. She met his gaze, her voice raw. "Then why does it feel like I do?" Marcus sighed, leaning against the counter. "Because breaking the record didn't close the door for you. It opened it. And now you have to decide if you're going to walk through or stay here." Her students began to notice too. "Are you leaving us?" One girl asked quietly after class. Sarah shook her head quickly. "No, I'll always be here." But the girl's eyes were searching, doubtful. Sarah felt the lie in her own words. Not a lie of intention, but of truth. Because even as she promised, her presence, a part of her, was already elsewhere, chasing wind across deserts, measuring silence in miles. One night, alone in the shop, Sarah stood in front of the rifle on the wall. She touched the stock lightly, tracing the grain with her fingertips. Her father's voice came back to her, softer than ever. "Precision isn't about distance. It's about dignity." She closed her eyes. Was dignity in staying, building, teaching? Or was it in continuing, pushing, daring again? There was no answer in the silence, only the weight of choice. The next morning, she gathered her students. "You came here to learn how to hit targets," she told them. "But targets aren't what matter. It's not about distance. It's not about records. It's about patience, stillness, respect." She looked at each of them, at their eager eyes, their hungry hearts. "If you carry that," she said softly, "then it doesn't matter if you ever hit the farthest plate. You'll already have learned the hardest part." They nodded, some understanding, some not. But Sarah knew she was speaking as much to herself as to them. That evening, Marcus found her outside, staring at the horizon again. "Thinking?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Always. About what's next?" Her smile faded. "About whether I'm supposed to chase it or let it chase me." The wind brushed her face. The desert stretched infinite. Somewhere out there, beyond the range, beyond the horizon, lay distances no one had yet dared. And Sarah Martinez stood on the edge, torn between the home she had built and the silence that still called her name. What do you do when the silence won't let you rest? For weeks, Sarah carried that question with her. Through the lessons she taught, through the patient corrections of her students' grips and breathing, through the soft encouragement she gave to shaky hands and doubtful eyes, she carried it. The silence pressed in at night, and though her days were filled with voices and laughter and learning, the quiet hours reminded her of the desert, of Nevada, of that single moment when her world had shrunk to a trigger and an eternity of air. Sometimes she thought maybe she could live with it. Maybe the shop, the range, the students, it was enough. She saw their progress. She saw their pride. And there were moments, small, fleeting, when she caught herself smiling, when the ache eased. But the silence always returned. One evening, long after the last student had left, Sarah locked up the shop and sat alone at the workbench. Her father's tools were still arranged exactly as he had left them. Years hadn't dulled the grooves in the wooden handles, the edges worn smooth by his hands. She picked up one of his screwdrivers, rolling it in her palm. She imagined him standing beside her, patient, quiet, eyes watching not her mistakes, but her persistence. Was this what you wanted for me? She whispered. To carry it forward? To teach? Or was it always about more? The silence gave no answer. But as Sarah set the tool down, she realized the question itself was flawed. It had never been about what her father wanted. It had always been about what she would choose. Marcus saw it too. "You're restless," he said one morning, watching her linger at the edge of the range while her students practiced. "I'm fine," she replied, too quickly. "Sarah, I've known soldiers who came home with medals and couldn't sit still for the rest of their lives because the world had shown them something they couldn't forget." She didn't meet his gaze. "You think that's what this is? I think you touched a part of yourself most people never find, and now you don't know whether to honor it by staying still or by moving again." Sarah exhaled, long and heavy. "What if either choice means I lose something?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "Then maybe it's not about winning or losing. Maybe it's about being honest with yourself." Weeks passed. Sarah kept teaching, kept smiling, kept pretending the silence wasn't chasing her, until one morning, a student asked a question that broke her facade. "Will you ever try again? Another record?" The range went still. Everyone waited for her answer. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came, because she didn't know. Because part of her wanted to say no, that she was done, that teaching was enough. But another part, buried deeper, whispered yes. She swallowed hard. "Records aren't the point," she said at last. "The point is what you learn about yourself while chasing them." It was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. That night, Sarah returned to the rifle hanging on the wall. She touched it lightly. Her reflection in the polished steel faint, blurred. For the first time, she didn't feel the same hunger, the same restlessness. Instead, she felt peace. Not because the silence had left her, but because she realized something. The silence wasn't a curse. It was a companion, a reminder that the journey wasn't about one shot, one record, one moment. It was about how she carried it. Her father had lived his life in precision, in patience, in quiet dignity. She had lived hers in shadow, then in obsession, then in triumph. But now she understood. The point wasn't to chase distance forever. The point was to know when to stand still and when to step forward, and sometimes dignity meant letting the silence stay. Months later, Sarah stood at the back of her range, watching her students. Their laughter carried on the wind, mingling with the sharp cracks of rifles. The soft clang of steel struck clean. She didn't hold a rifle that day. She didn't need to, because in their eyes, the determined ones, the doubtful ones, the ones who missed and missed again until they finally hitch, she saw her own journey reflected back. And she realized that maybe this was the record that mattered most. Not the distance she had broken, but the lives she was shaping. The rifle that had made the impossible shot still hung on the wall. Students glanced at it with awe, whispered about it when they thought she couldn't hear. But Sarah never bragged, never reminded them, because the rifle was not a trophy. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the simplest challenge, and sometimes the truest. Precision isn't measured in meters. It's measured in patience. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the sky in bruised colors, Sarah stood alone at the range. The desert wind curled around her, soft and steady, carrying with it the memory of silence. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and let the stillness settle. Then she whispered the words she had come to understand were her father's final lesson, the one he never had to speak aloud. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.